Hi, I'm Larry Blank, and this is From the Pit number 13. I thought I'd talk today about orchestration for Broadway shows and the size of the orchestra. It's a bit techy and inside information, but I thought it might be fascinating. And how the instrumentation is set for a Broadway show, or at least how it used to be. Um, Basically, from the early 40s when Don Walker orchestrated Best Foot Forward, that was the orchestra set up for decades after that. Before that, the orchestras were basically coming down from the opera orchestra to the operetta orchestra, then to musical theater. So the orchestras were somewhere between 20 and 30 musicians in the orchestra pits of Broadway at that time. And there would be a reed section, a brass section, and mostly a larger string section because of the operettas and operas that they came from. But musical comedy needed saxophones. So Best Foot Forward, I think Don Walker had like 5 saxophones, maybe 3 trumpets, 2 trombones. Uh, the 5 saxophone players all doubled on woodwinds, clarinet, flute. A very small string section, like a string quartet, maybe an extra violin, so 3 violins, a viola, and a cello, and a rhythm section. Over the years, this changed, so the string section was slightly larger, maybe the brass section was slightly larger, but the basic evolution of a Broadway pit was 3 trumpets, 2 or 3 trombones, a horn or 2, 4 or 5 woodwinds that all doubled on saxophone, a string section which evolved to maybe 6 violins, 2 violas, and 2 cellos, and a bass, drums, percussion, sometimes a harp. And that was the basic orchestra for many, many shows. Shows like Carousel, which were produced by the Theater Guild, and it was Rodgers and Hammerstein, right after their gigantic success with Oklahoma, had a slightly larger orchestra because Richard Rodgers insisted. He was successful, and they were happy to do it. So, and then Most Happy Fellow, Frank Lesser's show had a bigger orchestra. There might have been some other exceptions. Smaller orchestras were not the norm, even though there were some shows done with small orchestras. So that was the basic orchestra. And by the time I was working on Broadway in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s and beyond, the orchestra pit was basically 20 to 26 musicians in the pit. And it started to trim down. Now, I think 19 would be an excessively large orchestra for a Broadway show. Although when they did the revival of Sunset Boulevard a year ago, or 2 years ago, with Glenn Close, Angela and Weber insisted on 40 musicians. And now they're doing another revival, and it's probably a great deal less. But, for example, when I did my first Broadway show as a takeover conductor, Good Time Charlie, in 1975 at the Palace Theater, we had 2 trumpets, 3 trombones, 1 horn. I remember this distinctly. 5 woodwind players that all doubled. There were no saxophones in that pit with multiple reeds, and a violin section of 6 violins and 3 celli, which was orchestrated by Jonathan Tunick. There was a percussionist. No piano in the pit, drums. There was a guitar in the pit, and there was a harp in the pit. And that was slightly different orchestra in that there were 3 trumpets and 3 trombones and 2 trumpets. The standard big band show was 3 trumpets and 3 trombones, and that was the Broadway sound. 3 trumpets. That's what's the sound we're used to. That's the sound of Gypsy, Bye Bye Birdie, all the big musicals. The more legit shows, more classically oriented music, might have had 2 trumpets. Good Time Charlie was one of those shows. Jonathan decided for some reason or another that violas or violi were not necessary, so he did 6 violins and 3 celli, which is a very good sound for a Broadway pit. So that's how that evolved. A little night music, which I had conducted on the road as assistant conductor, also had a similar orchestration. There were, on that show, 3 French horns, 1 trombone, and I believe 2 trumpets originally, which could have been done with one trumpet. There was so little trumpet writing. String section with 6 violins, 2 violi, 2 cello, harp. Rhythm section, there was no guitar. The keyboard was mostly a celeste part, or celeste, some prefer it that way. And just one little piano solo. That's why the piano was in the pit. Interesting. And different shows had varying orchestrations. I believe Phil Lang, when he did 42nd Street, wanted to do something really unusual. So I believe it had 3 trumpets, 3 trombones, 3 French horns, and 7 woodwinds, which was similar to what No Strings had done in 1962 with the Ralph Burns orchestration, where there literally were no strings in the pit, with the exception of a bass and a harp and a guitar. If you consider those strings, there were no violins, viola, or cello. Same thing with 42nd Street, and Phil used that same orchestration for a revival of Can Can at that time, which wasn't very successful, neither the show, but the orchestration was. So later on, when I was orchestrating on my own as an orchestrator rather than a conductor, or as a conductor participating in the makeup of orchestration, we'd sit and talk about the show. They're Playing Our Song, which was my first show as the original music director. Marvin Hamlish was the composer. And I said this in an earlier podcast, but he set up an orchestra that was more for the recording studio. So in that pit, we had 2 trumpets, 2 trombones, no horns, and 3 woodwinds doubling. We had 2 guitars, we had 2 keyboards, we had a harp, we had a drummer, we had a percussion, and we had a violin section. And opening night in New York, we had 8 violins, 2 violi, and 2 cello. And those 2 extra violins were at Marvin Hamlish's expense because he thought it would sound better. Invariably, it got cut down, and on the road, it was probably 4 violins, 1 viola, 1 cello. They were just playing a lot of whole notes, goose eggs, as we say, just fat chords behind the ballads. And it was a kind of a record date orchestra, meaning it was for tunes in the recording studio. I mentioned in an earlier podcast that originally Marvin wanted 2 French horns and no trombones, but Ralph Burns, after starting to write the show, insisted on the trombones instead of the French horns, and that's what we did. So the next show I did after that was Vita in Los Angeles, and that instrumentation had been set by Hershey Kay some years earlier. And that instrumentation was, if I remember correctly, 2 trumpets, 1 trombone, and 3 French horns. Might have been 2 French horns. I think it was 3, and a trombone. And a string section, very small section. It was 5 violins and 3 cellos, no violi, 2 keyboards, 2 guitars, once again, percussion, drums, bass. And the woodwinds were originally 3, but the conductor, Rene Wiegert, added a 4th, which was English horn and oboe. So that was another recording studio type orchestra. The next show I did on Broadway was called Onward Victoria. And we were at the Martin Beck Theater, and the general manager, Joe Harris, actually was very kind to me and gave me some extra musicians, even though it was above the house minimum at the theater. And we had a couple of trumpets, a couple of trombones, a couple of French horns, I believe 4 woodwinds that doubled, maybe 5, I think it was 4. Irv Kostel did the orchestrations. The string section was 5 violins and 2 cello. So it was kind of a semi-legit orchestra. There were no saxophones in the orchestra. I'm sorry, I was talking about Onward Victoria. The orchestrator was Michael Gibson. Missed that one. Irv Kostel did Copperfield later on. And both of these shows had similar orchestrations because we were cut down, but they were basically 2 trumpet shows, a couple of horns and a couple of trombones, which was we used to call that a Noah orchestra, 2 by 2, 2 trumpets, 2 trombones, 2 horns, which was a healthy compromise for a theater pit. For the bigger musicals, things like Sugar Babies, which is a big brassy show, 3 trumpets and 3 trombones was the norm, with a French horn thrown in. And that was a common big band sound. The string section was always compromised. It got more interesting when I had to write orchestrations on my own. So when Mark Shaman and I did the orchestrations for Catch Me If You Can, we had a smaller orchestra minimum at the Neil Simon Theater. And we only had 2 violins and a cello. On the recording, we had a full string section. We had 2 trumpets and 1 trombone. That was all. And 3 woodwinds who doubled. We had 3 keyboards in the pit. One of the keyboards was at least reinforcing the brass and woodwinds. But nevertheless, I still had to write, as did Mark, for what we actually had, which was 3 brass and 3 reeds. So in voicing all of those big brass chords, I tried to voice it as completely as possible with the existing section and just beefed it up a little bit with a keyboard. You have to anticipate that keyboard may not blend so that it sounds good by itself. So I was always very careful about the voicings in that. And the same thing with the string section. There's not much you can do with 2 violins and a cello. If you write them in unison, it's a little bit out of tune. So I would just always go ahead and write as if I had a real string section. And for some reason, it always sounded really nice, and I was very pleased by that. The rhythm section was the same on all these shows. When I did Drowsy Chaperone, I was offered the job by producer Kevin McCullum, who was very happy with my work on White Christmas, which had a full 24-piece complement. But Drowsy, when I heard the score, I told Kevin that I thought the orchestra should be no more than 15 at best. I thought if we did more than that, it would be overkill for the score and the style of the show. He was flabbergasted that I didn't insist on 26 musicians, but I just thought it was inappropriate for the show. So when we did this smaller orchestration of 14 or 15, I felt there was no need for any strings. The reason is I didn't want to have 1 violin in the pit or 1 cello or 2 violins and a cello, which I thought would sound puny and insignificant. It was supposed to be a big musical from the late 20s, but it was also a fluff piece, and it was your impression of an orchestra of that period rather than the real orchestra. Most of the numbers were intimate, with the exception of a few big production numbers. So, thinking about that, I said, let's make it sound like an MGM movie version of a musical. And I decided to go with 3 trumpets, the Broadway sound, 2 trombones, and 4 woodwinds, doubling every instrument they could possibly own. So we had 2 soprano saxes. I had an E-flat contrabass clarinet on the bottom. I could also have 2 alto saxophones, a tenor saxophone, and a baritone saxophone. I had 3 or 4 clarinets with a bass clarinet. The bottom reed also played bassoon. The third reed also played oboe and English horn. They played flutes, so I could have all sorts of combinations, 2 flutes, 2 clarinets, a flute, a clarinet, and a bass clarinet, a flute, a clarinet, an oboe, and a bassoon for a classical thing, plus the 4 saxophones. And in the brass section, with the 3 trumpets and 2 trombones, I could make quite a bit of noise. I didn't try to emulate any strings at all on the show. And I was very careful about the keyboard writing. It was basically 1 keyboard, but the second keyboard was added basically because we needed an assistant conductor chair and for a few special sound effects during the show. So that second keyboard just helped along a little bit. and the rhythm section. There was originally no guitar in the pit, but there's a ukulele uh, uh, in the last scene of the show, which we did on synth. But when we got to New York, we added the actual player. So that's the way orchestras are designed these days. That's how you figure out the instrumentation. If you look back at the orchestrations for other Broadway shows, like West Side Story, for instance, West Side Story had 5 reeds, 2 trombones, 2 French horns, and 3 trumpets. 5 reeds, doubled on every instrument imaginable. It was actually kind of very, bizarre at the time, because there was a bass sax, there were piccolos, flutes, there was everything, and it was soprano sax. It was spread all over the woodwind section, and even the oboe doubler played many, many instruments. It was very new for the time. Now, interestingly, and the story has been reported elsewhere, but there were 7 violins and 4 celli, no violi, which was a big surprise at the time, considering it was Leonard Bernstein. And he was this famous conductor and musician, eclectic musician. And the reason there were no violi, and the story has been told many times, is because in those days there were house musicians at all the Broadway theaters. That meant 4 or 5 musicians that came with the theater, whether you're doing a straight play or a musical. Very often, these extra musicians were relatives of the theater owner or the producer, and they weren't necessarily musicians. It might have been somebody's niece who owned a violin or a viola. It might have been an old friend of the producer, or a brother-in-law, or an uncle, or someone else on the payroll. So it was a way of putting money back in the theater owner or the producer's hands. Eventually, that was eliminated later on, but a long time later on, so like in the 70s and 80s. But the house musicians at the Winter Garden Theater at that time were 2 celli and 2 violi. And when Bernstein heard them on an earlier show, he said to Irv Kostel and Sid Raymond, the orchestrators, let's let the violi play in the lobby. Let's forget it. And he said the 2 celli were good enough to play whole notes, and they put them in the pit. And then they brought in 2 other cellists who could play a little bit more complicated stuff. So if you look at the scores for West Side Story, you'll see that 2 of the celli are playing goose eggs, big fat whole notes, while the other 2 celli are playing a lot of stuff. And there were only 7 violins. The house minimum was somewhere between 26 and 28, and that's why there's an odd number of violins. There were, interestingly, only 1 percussion and 1 drummer on the original West Side Story. If you look at the published partiture, it lists 4 percussionists. That is simply not what it was on Broadway, but when they did the publication, they broke it up so it was a more playable bunch of percussion parts. But in the original pit, it was 1 percussionist and 1 drummer who did all of it. There was a guitar in the pit as well. There was a pianist in the pit. There was 1 bass. And as I said, 7 violins, 4 celli, 3 trumpets, 2 trombones, 2 French horns. And that set the tone for quite a while at that time, because it was such a staggeringly amazing orchestration and score. And to this day, everyone thinks of that as the turning point in the sound of Broadway, where it improved a great deal. But think of this, that same season, the musical that competed with West Side Story was a musical called Music Man, which, despite saying 76 trombones, I believe there were only 3 of them and 3 trumpets. There were no French horns in the orchestra. And there was a bass sax in that orchestra in the woodwind doublings, and a string section, I believe, of 6, 2, and 2. However, just as a little side note, the winner of Best Musical Tony in that year was Music Man over West Side Story. West Side Story took many years to become the popular piece it was, mostly after the film was done in 1962. So everybody wasn't as impressed as we might be these days by West Side Story, but it was innovative and special to all of us. My Fair Lady, on the other hand, was another show that had a big brass section, including a tuba, which Robert Russell Bennett was very fond of using in the pit. He used it in a lot of Rodgers and Hammerstein shows. The Lerner and Loewe shows had it too, and a few other shows had it. I personally find the tuba in a theater pit, unless you're doing a chorus of The Lonely Goatherd in Sound and Music or a show like Music Man, to be very intrusive in the orchestration. Excuse me. There were other shows that had the bass player doubling on tuba, which was not uncommon. There were several guys on Broadway who specialized in that. And Phil Lang used that a lot, especially on the Jerry Herman shows. And also Irv Kostal used it in Fiorello. And the tuba played on maybe one or two numbers. Otherwise, he's playing string bass. So, interesting stuff. I'm trying to think of some other shows that had interesting orchestrations. I know that Eddie Sauter took delight in messing around with theater orchestrations. On the show 1776, he had one trumpet in the orchestra because that's all he felt he needed, and it doubled on piccolo trumpet for certain songs like the Lees of West Virginia. The Lees of Virginia. I don't know where I came up with West Virginia. And piccolo trumpet was also used on a lot of other shows. Some people think the piccolo trumpet is used just because it's good for higher notes. It's just as difficult to play as a regular B-flat trumpet or a C trumpet, but it has a special sound for that special Bach Brandenburg Concerto sound, or as in 1776. So that was quite fascinating. A lot of shows had a piccolo in the pit, and some shows didn't, but most of the time one of the flute players doubled on piccolo. I'm trying to think of other shows that had interesting instrumentations. Tenderloin, which was a show by Bach and Harnick that Irv Kostal orchestrated, had an organ in the pit. Also, Baker Street, orchestrated by Don Walker, had an organ in the pit. The show Superman, It's a Bird, It's a Plane, Superman, Eddie Sauter, had an organ in the pit. A few other shows went so far as to have 3 French horns. Little Night Music is one that comes to mind. Most Happy Fella, Sound of Music, I believe Carousel did. 3 French horns is closer to the symphonic use of 4 French horns, but it's an indulgence in most theater pits because we don't really need it. It's usually more a color. For instance, Julie Stein on his musicals always loved to have a French horn in the pit. For solos, for instance, the end of the Gypsy Overture, what would it be without those horn whoops at the end of the overture? And for the beautiful sounds, Little Night Music, and of course for the depth of the score of South Pacific. It really added a lot. Bill Brown, another orchestrator who did quite a few shows, was very fond of the Noah approach, using 2 trumpets, 2 trombones, and 2 horns, which covered a lot of different issues in musicals. However, he used that on Crazy for You and also Sweet Smell of Success, which were big brassy shows, and a lot of other orchestrators discussed that it might have been better with 3 trumpets on both those shows, especially Sweet Smell of Success, which was Marvin Hamlisch's kind of jazz score. However, as Jonathan Tunick ironically pointed out, that 4 trumpets would not have made the show get better reviews. So the trumpets will never save the show, although There is a saying in theater pits that as the first trumpet goes, so goes the show. What they mean by that is shows like Gypsy, where would it be without the lead trumpet player, Dick Perry, playing all those riffs in the overture and all the other wonderful sounds that came out of that pit? There were other shows that really required some blasting trumpet playing to put it over the top. Not that the trumpet playing made the show happen, but it sure helped. Other shows like Bye Bye Birdie, which was orchestrated by Robert Ginsler, really known as Red Ginsler, used multiple reed doublers. And on the recording of Bye Bye Birdie, there's an overture which actually was not used in the theater. It was written specifically for the recording and ended up in the published score as Entr'acte B, for those of you who follow such things. But it was not used in the theater. In the theater, there was a video for Bye Bye Birdie. And there were several overtures in the score that were used to accompany the video. But they felt for the recording, Goddard Lieberson, the record producer, felt it needed an overture. And they asked Ginsler to write one. And that's the overture we're used to hearing on the record, which had 12 violins and 4 cellos. But of course, in the theater pit, no such animal existed. It was 6 violins and 2 celli at best. On many of the show recordings that we hear, the string section was doubled. So it's kind of a misnomer to think that Broadway shows really sounded like some of those recordings. We were spoiled. Goddard Lieberson always doubled the string section, and he set that precedent for many show recordings. So all those wonderful recordings that came out of Columbia in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and a little bit beyond, had these enlarged string sections, which made them sound a lot better than they did in the theater. However, I can attest from having sat in the theater in the 60s that shows sounded pretty great acoustically before the sound systems evolved to what they are today. You could hear everything. You could hear the singers, and you could also hear, with much detail, the orchestra without much amplification. The theaters were built for that, and that's what they did. So I hope this is interesting to at least some of you to hear a little bit of how the sound of Broadway orchestras developed. I'm happy to talk more about it. And please let me know if you have any requests in that order or anything else about musical pits and from the pit. I will be interviewing some more people. I just thought it was interesting for a while to do some solo podcasts and express some of my thoughts about the musical theater and musical theater pits. I hope you find it interesting. Thanks for watching.